And one would think that a benevolent, all-powerful being would take some kind of steps to reduce some of this pain and suffering. You have the problem of silence, in that why would an omnipotent God choose to reveal itself to just a few people and then count on that message to be relayed to the rest of humanity across all time? You know, if I were a god and I cared what a particular species of apes believed on a certain planet, then I would make sure everyone got the same message delivered in the same way. However, so often the important evidences in a religion tend to conveniently disappear rather quickly. You had Jesus resurrected, hung out on earth for a few weeks, and then went back to heaven. You had Muhammad, flew up to heaven on his horse, and the angel Moroni collected the golden tablets back from Joseph Smith and took them back to heaven. And one has to ask themselves, why couldn't these individuals or artifacts have remained on earth longer, perhaps for all of time, to spread their message to all of humanity? I think it's fundamentally unfair to provide some individuals with some evidence that's really compelling, and then people like us are left with ancient writings and anecdotes from often on anonymous sources written down in a 2,000-year-old document. Yet the Israelites, when they were supposedly led out of Egypt, were fed manna from the sky, led by columns of fire during the day, or fire at night and clouds during the day, to the promised land over 40 years. So they had a ton of evidence to convince them that God exists, and we're left with very little of anything. So then we have to ask, why does God choose to remain hidden? Apologists would say that, well, it goes back to free will. If God just revealed himself to all of us, we would have to believe that we'd be forced to. This explanation doesn't work in the Christian doctrine, at least, because you have the existence of Satan, and he would have been, according to the story, absolutely aware of God's existence. And in fact, they were kind of buddies. They hung out and discussed Job's fate and all of that. But so he would have been absolutely aware of God's existence, yet he was able to choose to rebel, and we would not be forced to believe either. And I already talked about we are all left to suffer the same fate for disbelief, yet some people get more evidence than others. It's fundamentally unfair. The problem of non-belief, and what this is basically just showing, is that an omnipotent God couldn't exist because such a being would not be so inept at spreading his important message. You look at the world religion breakdown, you can see how fragmented the world religions are. Non-religious people, again, are the third largest group, so not insignificant. And Christianity looks like a pretty big chunk, but you got to realize there are, I don't know what the last tally is, but at least over 1,000 different denominations of Christianity. So if you actually split that up, because most denominations think all the other denominations have it wrong and they're going to hell, and only their denomination is the right one. So if you actually split it up, it would look a lot more fragmented than it does. And then you have the problem of hell. Now this only applies, I suppose, to Christians who believe in a literal, eternal hell. That's for non-believers. Again, I would contend that eternal punishment for finite crimes is an immoral doctrine. To punish someone forever for crimes committed over any kind of a finite period of time, no matter what the crimes are, that's, in my opinion, by definition, is immoral. In Christianity, you have to accept the scapegoat deal to escape eternal punishment. You have to basically foist your sins upon an innocent person. And then you have to ask, can a God who condemns people to hell be benevolent? It wasn't Satan who created hell in the Christian doctrine. And then how do those in heaven deal with this? For instance, once you go to heaven, you are supposedly let in on all the great truths of life and reality, I would imagine. So you would know that hell exists and that there are billions and billions of people being tortured for eternity. A couple of quotes from early church fathers. Tertullian said that, "At the greatest of all spectacles, that last and eternal judgment, how shall I admire, how laugh, how rejoice, how exult, when I behold so many proud monarchs groaning in the lowest abyss of darkness." And Thomas Aquinas said, "That the saints may enjoy their beatitude more thoroughly and give more abundant thanks for it to God, a perfect sight of the punishment of the damned is granted them. So kind of early in the Church of Christianity, one of the perks of being in heaven was getting to watch all the non-believers burn and cry and gnash teeth. Doesn't sound like a great time to me, but I guess that's how they did things back in the day. And so you have to wonder then, my mother is still a Christian, and myself and one of my brothers is an atheist now, so one has to wonder, how does she get to enjoy an eternity of supposed bliss when she has the absolute knowledge that her sons are being tortured forever by a God she's supposedly supposed to worship 24/7 now that she's with him. And then real briefly, the arguments for God. These are the big ones, I guess. The cosmological argument basically says that everything that exists must have a cause. The universe exists, therefore it had to have a cause, and that cause is God. I kind of like this argument because it's self-refuting. It says in the first premise that everything that exists must have a cause, but then it uses a little backdoor at the end to say, well, God just created everything. Well, then if your first premise says everything that exists has to have a cause, then your God has to have a cause too. So it's kind of a self-refuting argument. I mean, we can just say matter and energy may just as well be eternal because you're breaking your first premise by saying your God is eternal. We can make the same claim about the universe, and like I said, it doesn't answer the question of what caused God. So you have the teleological argument, which is the argument from design, or sometimes it's called the watchmaker argument. The universe evidences great complexity or design, according to this argument. It must have therefore been designed by a designer or a God. This is sometimes called the watchmaker argument, as Paley put it. And the problem with this is that it's a bad analogy. It tries to compare rocks and trees to watches and airplanes. For instance, we know where watches and airplanes come from. We can go to the factories and observe them being made. We have no exposure or knowledge of watches or airplanes self-assembling themselves, or of any kind of process by which they could evolve over natural selection. However, we do have a good understanding of how biological systems evolve over time. And then, like I said, Big Bang and evolutionary theory explain all the design that we can see quite adequately. And then there's the ontological argument, which I almost hate to bring up, but it's one of the big arguments. I just don't understand why it would be convincing to anyone. This was proposed by 12th century theologian Anselm, and he basically said God is the greatest imaginable being, and one of the aspects of greatness or perfection would be existence. Therefore, God must exist. It's basically a word game to define God into existence. Basically saying if you can conceive of the greatest possible being, one of the attributes of being a great thing would be to exist. Therefore, since you can conceive it, God exists. The problem with this argument is that you could really apply this kind of logic to anything. You could say, well, since I can conceive of a greatest possible island or a ferry, a great island must also exist, therefore it exists. It just doesn't make sense. And even if I were to grant all of these premises and say, yep, everyone makes sense, you're right, you just proved whatever God this proves, not a single one of these gets you a step closer to proving the kind of personal God with the human emotions that we see in the major world religions today. And then lastly, it seems like most theists will eventually fall back on this, Pascal's wager, which I don't recommend doing, and I'll show you why, but for some reason to people it seems very intuitively obvious. And what Blaise Pascal came up with this wager, or gambit as he called it, I believe. And he says it basically broke it down to a mathematical thing, or if you were to bet on God, say, if you believe and you're wrong, you have nothing to lose. For instance, if you choose to believe that there's a God and you happen to be wrong and you die and there isn't a God, well, you just died, nothing bad happens to you. You didn't lose anything. However, if you disbelieve and you're wrong and there does exist a God, then you basically have everything to lose. You risk hellfire, all that bad stuff. So in his opinion, it was the safer bet to bet on God, basically, is how he would have put it. The problems with, it sounds convincing, but there's a lot of problems with this. And I'll just hit a few. It assumes only one God, which obviously